The Horse Race Politics podcast accompanies our forecasting website, horseracepolitics.co.uk. That's horseracepolitics.co.uk. No spaces, all one word, all lowercase. Go to the website now to join the race and predict various outcomes of the 2024 US presidential election, including the overall winner, the key swing states, and likelihoods of post-election violence. This podcast is brought to you by our partners at Focus Games and the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, or WIZARD, as well as Swansea University. Hello, and welcome back to Horse Race Politics 2024. In this podcast, we're covering the 2024 US presidential election, surprise, surprise, using our new website, Horse Race Politics, a gamified forecasting platform where you can submit forecasts to various aspects of the 2024 election. Today, we're going to be talking about what's happened over the last week since our last episode, as the race tightens to an unprecedented level, one that is actually tighter than at any point during the Trump-Biden contest in 2020. Joining me are two fantastic co-hosts. Everyone knows my first one from our first episode. Matt, how are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing okay. I was pretty disappointed with my Kamala Harris 2 to 4% lead forecast, which was right until maybe an hour before the closing point, at which point it had shrunk into 1.8, I think, and it's continued to shrink since then. So my whole Harris suite of forecasts is looking increasingly shaky, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, so just for context, on Horse Race Politics, we have a lot of races that are running to the election day, but we're also running a weekly one which asks people to predict the size of Harris's polling lead relative to Trump, according to the Financial Times. And we had 3 different categories, and I think for the most part we were all kind of, myself included, very happy that she would be in this kind of 2 to 4 point lead, and then it just capitulated. It's now around 1.7, 1.8, but we'll kind of get into that. But anyway, so my other co-host, Richard, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you can bring to the table in this conversation.
I'm a veteran of Horse Race Politics podcasts, having done this with Matt back in 2020, where we had a rare old time, didn't we, Matt? When we did it.
It was lively enough. It was a COVID podcast. That was, yeah.
It was. So my sort of I'm the head of the School of Culture and Communication in Swansea. My sort of specialist chosen subject, if you like, is the kind of news reporting of some of the key elements of 21st century life, and I'm the co-author of a book called Reporting Elections, which is a sort of a study really of how elections are covered across the world, generally on the television, which is often the most interesting medium for politics and elections, because particularly in this country, of course, it's obliged to be impartial, which many of the media platforms are not obliged to be. So I have a kind of interest in particularly election coverage. That's where I'm coming from on all of this.
Brilliant. Okay, well, fantastic. Nice to meet both of you, obviously. So today, the real focus comes from this kind of like calamitous, well, it depends on which way you look at it. It's been a very seismic shift that we've seen in the last week. Effectively, I believe 538's polling tracker had Harris at about a 2.4 percentage point lead about a week ago. It's now down to about 1.8. So we're seeing about a quarter of her polling lead has just gone. So I guess one of the kind of general questions that I kind of like to start with is whether you are more of the mentality that this has been the Trump camp doing good and gaining on Harris in conjunction with Harris's campaign maybe stalling in momentum, or whether we're really just kind of resetting. Maybe this is the baseline, maybe this is where things should have been, and Harris's lead was maybe actually more of the outlier than anything, because I feel like those are two very different ways of looking at the last week, particularly as there hasn't really been any exogenous shock. No October surprise. We haven't had Hillary's emails come out of nowhere. We haven't had any Access Hollywood tapes. We haven't had any, nobody's been shot. No high profile thing has happened to really cause
Nobody's been shot this week.
This week, yeah. Well, we'll see. So, we'll start with you, Matt. What's your general take, your general overview of the last week?
Yeah, and I think it speaks to a kind of a wider gap that's opening up between really two well-established ways of looking at election campaigns in political science. So what I would have sort of said before this narrowing was that Harris's lead reflected more or less a crystallization of kind of an incumbency advantage with a relatively high performing economy. So I mentioned in our first podcast that I've been following Alan Lichtman's 13 keys system, as he'd kind of essentially called the race for Kamala Harris quite a way in advance. And those of you who follow these kind of things will know that he's had a very good track record over 40 years of election forecasting. But his
perfect record, no? It's been perfect.
2000 aside.
Well, 2000, okay.
Yeah, so he would have said that he more or less called it right, but the counting didn't go correctly. And I think I remember Richard on a previous episode telling me about drinking all night and being more hanging than the hanging chads in the 2000 election. So that was, to be fair, nobody really could have forecast that well. But his approach generally speaks to a wider way of looking at forecasting, which really focus on what are called the fundamentals of an election campaign. And this way of forecasting sees elections really as a sort of a referendum on the incumbent party or politician, and in particular focuses in on the extent to which they have shepherded the economy into a good sort of state of performance. And I think the Harris campaign and the Biden administration has a relatively strong story to tell, especially if you look at the figures in the last year or so. So Lichtman uses the inflation-adjusted growth figures, and they've been strong, and especially kind of as we've approached the election, they've become stronger and been stronger than predicted. And so normally in that context, scholars like Lynn Bavrek would talk about how, well, really, if you're an incumbent with a strong economy, all you need to do is to get that message across to the electorate, and that should deliver you victory. And if you're not an incumbent with a strong economy, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to overcome. You need to make the election about something else. So I would have seen the kind of state of polling as likely to be pretty stable, not because of those sort of fundamental forces being kind of locked in at this point, but also because of everything that we've gone through with Donald Trump. You'd sort of think that opinion on him is basically crystallized now to the point that it's nearly impossible to change it, right? That so many things have happened. So I had expected quite a smooth run in. Whereas the alternative way of looking at forecasting is what someone like Nate Silver would be doing, which is kind of poll-based projection. And poll-based projection, especially when you map that kind of that tightening national picture across the kind of key swing states, does now make Donald Trump the favorite if the polling is completely accurate. And indeed, this is reflected in the betting markets, which have moved him to about a 63% favorite now from being an even shot a few weeks ago. And so we're sort of starting to see a clash of those things, and a lot depends on. None of this actually answers your question very well, which is like, well, is this a dip, or is this the actual state of the popularity of Harris and Trump? And it's quite difficult to answer that question. I do feel like the Harris campaign, in targeting, so she's been touring with like Liz Cheney, who's Dick Cheney's daughter, who is a kind of an anti-Trump Republican. I think they're focusing on the wrong audience. I think it's going to be difficult to persuade people who've supported Trump to change their minds at this point. I think they'd be a lot better served to mobilize the people who want to vote for them. Again, we said in the last pod that I think a high turnout, anything above 65%, is excellent news for the Democrats. And yet they don't seem to be running that kind of a campaign at this point. But I'd be interested to hear what Richard thinks, because he's a seasoned campaign watcher. But it doesn't seem to me to be like, I was expecting to see Taylor Swift taking the stage, with well, seriously, that kind of fun, high energy, turnout based campaign.
Eminem was on stage with Barack Obama, I believe yesterday or the day before. So. Maybe,
but I think there was a moment in time, wasn't there, when at the end of the single only presidential debate between the two of them that Taylor Swift very quickly came out in favour of Harris, and I mean that was the opportunity there, was to make some capital out of that, and I think that's missed. I mean, I think my take on all of this, and it did make me think of a class I was teaching in the week actually, where it was about election coverage, and I was making the point, or telling the students, of course, and we're teaching students who wouldn't have known any of this, about the famous Gillian Duffy moment in 2010 that you can remember, when Gordon Brown was fairly indiscreet, not realising that he still had a live microphone on his lapel, and I played the students that film, and they were horrified. And
Did he call her a bigoted woman? Was it
that bigoted woman? Yeah, that's what he called her. And then of course he went back and apologised, and it was all very embarrassing. But I made the point that that has meant really that election campaigns have become incredibly buttoned up since. They're incredibly stage managed. They're incredibly kind of message driven and orchestrated and pre-rehearsed and pre-arranged. And I said to the class, can you imagine being Donald Trump's campaign manager? Can you imagine trying to keep him on script, in order, on message, all of that? And I think that he hasn't changed, has he? He's campaigning in the same way that he's always campaigned, off the cuff, not prepared, off the top of his head. So nothing much has changed there. So I think the fact that the Harris vote, or the Harris confidence, let's say, appears to be collapsing, is not because of anything he's done.
No.
It's because of something that Harris hasn't done, which is to land any serious punches on Donald Trump. And of course, where we are right now, we've had this breaking news story, which is sort of all over the media today, which is the in inverted commas, overseas interference in the election, where large groups of Labour supporters and officials are in the US, and I don't think there can be any denial that this is a sort of this is happening, and of course that's only going to play into Donald Trump's kind of slight kind of victim narrative, isn't it? He's got loads of more sort of material to go on now, so I think it's nothing to do with him. It's everything to do with a slightly ineffectual campaign, I think, by Kamala Harris. And I remember in the last podcast, Matt, we said, didn't we, about, I think you said, it's something like all Joe Biden has to do now is not to be Donald Trump. You can basically just sit back and watch somebody kind of, implode. Well, we're in a position where she can't afford to do that now. She has to go out and be brave and be bold, and she's got to try and win some votes back. And there's an uncomfortably short space of time, for her to do that now.
Well, I was just gonna before you come back, Louis, I was just gonna say that it's effectively like this week or bust. I mean, those of us who've watched a lot of campaigns, those last few days are in a kind of a weird stasis. This is it for Harris, and I think it's been notable. It was certainly a feature as she kind of took over from Joe Biden, that Trump was struggling to kind of land one of his traditional kind of mocking attack lines. So we all remember, I don't know, like Little Marco Rubio or Sleepy Joe. He has this kind of gift for mockery. But I tend to agree. He hasn't substantially undermined Harris in that way. It's more been a lack of energy and direction in the campaign that she's run.
Because I remember writing some blogs for a couple of different places after the debate, and my goodness, not only was, I think, the outcome fairly clear cut, but there was so much material for Harris to pick up on. I mean, what Trump was painting a picture of was this sort of almost dystopian, world that was just falling apart, where, people were invading the country and eating cats and dogs and all sorts of things. I mean, it was such an open goal in terms of the material that was being provided, and the fact that her campaign was not able to really capitalize on that and make something out of that a lot more than they did. I think it was a real strategic failure on behalf of that, and I think they might rue the day when they just didn't really major on some of the things he said on the television in that debate.
Well, I'd say two things just is to close off this little section is in the first place, like it's very telling that Trump's not having a second debate, right? Like that opportunity is not going to, like, to the extent that Trump can be controlled, he can be kept off a formalized 2 hour debate. But just on the Labour thing, this is so perfect for the kind of troll mentality that characterizes I would say, like, a lot of Trump's ideology is basically about owning the libs, because like all they were going on about was foreign interference in the election, right? So obviously, mostly through the kind of investigations into Russia's role, bot farms, troll farms, illicit influence. So like this is like one of the major attack lines of the Democrats being turned against them, and I think any fair observer would have to say with some legitimacy, the head of operations of the Labour Party posting this on LinkedIn is as much, it's much more of a smoking gun than Hunter Biden's laptop ever produced. And but it's just like from the narrative perspective, it's nearly like you couldn't have come up with a better way of kind of mocking and undermining and kind of turning back the arguments of the Democrats on them. And to be honest, how many volunteers are we talking about? That this isn't a big advantage for the Democratic Party.
There's some telling commentary from Henry Zefferman, who is the chief political correspondent on the BBC, and he's written quite a long piece about the LinkedIn thing, and he just says a couple of things. It's undeniable that this is a seriously awkward spot for the Labour government to find itself in, exactly 2 weeks before Starmer could well be placing a phone call congratulating President-elect Trump. And then at the end he says, this may not be a passing awkwardness, but a dispute threatening the most important diplomatic relationship any British Prime Minister has. So, I mean, I would imagine that if Keir Starmer was hoping for a Kamala Harris win, which I'm sure he was before today, he's definitely hoping for that, because at least it would avoid a very difficult conversation.
Well, it's good. At least we know Donald Trump doesn't take things personally, right?
Well, that's it. Aren't we fortunate there? Yeah, quite.
Do you see this as having any kind of serious consequence for the Labour Party in the UK? Because they're kind of in the trenches at the moment. The first 100 days have gone appallingly, and I think that's a pretty solid bipartisan consensus. And this just feels like another, death by 1,000 cuts at the moment. Do you see this as having? Does this take up a lot of political capital? And I guess it is in part determined by who wins the election. Because if Trump wins, you then get another 2 weeks of media questions being, "What about this? What about this?"
I think even on the most basic level, and it's obviously there's more nuance to it than this, but on the most basic level, people could probably say, can't you find work for these 100 folks at home? Aren't there any burning issues that they could be helping you to sort out back at home? But as you say, Louis, let's be kind. It's been a very rocky first 2 or 3 months, isn't it?
Maybe that's where they've sent Sue Gray, is it?
Well,
no, I mean
now she's like special envoy of
she's coming to Wales at some point, I think, to say hi to us, yeah, for the devolved regions and nations. But I think in and of itself, I think this has long happened. I think it's normal. Like, I think Conservative Party volunteers have often gone out to support Republicans. I think it's not an unusual thing to have happened. It's just to have left this evidence trail in contravention of US electoral law is speaks to this wider dysfunction that the Labour Party has been displaying now for about 100 and so days. Yeah, so I think a lot's going to swing on this election result globally. But the UK has unnecessarily increased the stakes for itself, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll pivot to a bit more of a unless anybody has any final thoughts on that. I'm going to pivot to a question that's a little bit happier for the Harris camp, and that is the number of early votes that we've been getting in so far. I believe we're at record levels of early votes, something about 21 to 22 million mail-in or early ballots have come in. Nationally, I think something about 40 to 50 million have been requested, which is quite a lot. And obviously, early voting is going to be slightly nicer for Republicans this time round because Trump is still being critical of it, but not as guns blazing. And a lot of other Republican candidates have been a bit more forgiving in encouraging people to go out and vote early. And, you know, NBC reports kind of the early figures for who has requested these by party registration. They don't know how these people are voting, but we can see who is requesting these. In some states, we're seeing massive imbalances. Michigan, it's about 53% are Democrats. Pennsylvania is probably the biggest disparity. 62% of the requested mail-in ballots, or the ones that have been submitted by registered Democrats, compared to 29% of Republicans. But in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, it's the other way around. We're seeing more Republicans than Democrats have, or registered, have submitted their votes. But the flip side of this is that Republican narrative might be a bit kinder to mail-in voting, but substantively, in terms of what they've actually done, they've really ramped up the legal assault on the early kind of mail-in ballot process. Roughly 100 lawsuits across the battleground states have been filed, trying to increase voter registration processes, trying to give election officials the power to stop counts, trying to give them the power to throw out ballots. There was a challenge, I want to say, in Georgia where that was actually thrown out by a judge, where basically the challenge was an election official wanted to just be able to stop counting if they didn't like what was going on. No real legal precedent. It was just, I think something fishy is going on. I don't like it. I want to stop counting, and that kind of just sows seeds of chaos. And we also know from kind of a foundational perspective of Project 2025, the potential handbook for a Trump administration, that Trump people have started to kind of make their way properly into the election process. So I guess my question for you guys is more abstract. You can speak to the politics specifically, but you can speak to America more generally. Is what are the consequences of this legal assault on trust in American politics generally, but just in American institutions? And do you think that this outlives Trump? Or do you think if Trump loses this election and maybe he disappears from politics, will it go with him? Because this is
I'm going to defer to Matt, but whilst you've been asking the question, Louis, I've just, because I saw this earlier on Twitter, Barack Obama's pinned tweet actually on his account. I mean, he's quite busy at the moment on Twitter, Obama. You rightly pointed out that there's lots of footage of Eminem on the stage and him endorsing Harris. But there on Barack Obama's pinned tweet, it's all about voting by mail, and he's sort of crafting that narrative. He's saying, I voted by mail. It was easy and a great excuse to say hi to some neighbours. If you're voting by mail like me, get your ballots in the mail right away, no matter how you vote. Make sure you have a plan and get it done. And then there's a 70-second video of the process of him filling his, and then sort of being escorted to the local post box, shaking hands with everybody that encounters. I imagine this is exactly what it would be like for Matt Wall to go down to the local shop. That's what it's like,
yeah.
That's when Matt goes to the pub. That's what it's like.
He's stopping every 10 seconds to shake hands with people, and even putting a little badge, I voted by mail sticker on. So this is clearly part of the strategy for Harris to get people out. You know, they're more likely to vote for her if it's, if you like, almost a sort of considered, informed, thoughtful vote. Perhaps the more impulsive voters are likely perhaps to go the other way by just sort of wavering until that, X marks the spot. Matt will have a more considered answer than that, I suspect.
Well, while Matt answers it, I'll come back to you after his answer. But it'd be great to kind of hear what you think on the kind of erosion of trust in media in America, because that has become arguably the battleground of polarization in America. But we can come back to that after Matt's.
Yeah, and the two. I mean, I'd just say the two things are related. Because obviously with the kind of tempo of counting that we experienced in 2020, the kind of the fact that that those postal ballots and or various early voting mechanisms were counted kind of later in the process was a huge part of the drama of the election evening as it unfolded. Um, I've been seeing quite mixed coverage, to be honest, of the kind of political dynamics of early voting. Um, as you said, the Republicans have been a lot more sanguine and encouraging their supporters to do it. Um, certainly, some analysts have seen an advantage just inherently for the Democrats in this mechanism, because you're trying to undo a lot of messaging over several years about the validity of this form of voting. And I think the fact that Obama is pushing it gives you some indication that the Democrats still see a big advantage. I think also we have to factor in that like 2020 was a pandemic election, and so like we saw huge numbers, a huge volume of postal voting there because of the kind of restrictions that people were facing, who are sort of vulnerable to infection by COVID. So the numbers are kind of historically high if you leave out 2020, if that makes sense. And but 2020 introduces such a kind of an outlier into the data that it's difficult to know exactly. But generally speaking, this is relatively historically high amount of early voting is seen as advantageous to the Democrats, especially in I think in Pennsylvania in particular, in some of the swing states. I've seen like Florida, the Republicans have been really quite effective at mobilizing early voting. So it's not a kind of a straightforward picture. Um, I do think that I do think that um, the multiplicity of ways in which you can cast a vote in America is quite a notable feature of that of the political system. Not just early voting versus voting on the day, but like the various ways in which ballots are cast and counted. The kind of the lack of uniformity there has been a source of I mean, going back to the hanging chads that I referenced earlier, I mean that referred to a kind of a punch hole system that um, if you didn't completely eliminate all of the paper, that the votes weren't counted. You have people pulling levers. You have people using voting machines. Obviously, we saw Dominion was a huge legal case that happened. So this kind of multiplicity of ways to vote, to be fair, doesn't inspire confidence, because every way to vote is a way to cheat the count. And what we do know is, just the last thing to say is, like, anyone who wants to get a sense of the systematic nature of this infiltration of the vote counting system should just listen back to some of the episodes of Steve Bannon's War Room that have been going out ever since 2020. This has been a sustained project on the part of that kind of wing of the Republican Party. So the court judgments were, I guess, encouraging from the point of view of electoral propriety. But if you have officials in the system who think the system is a conspiracy, it's going to be quite difficult for that system to provide a result everyone can agree with.
Coming back to your question about trust in the media, I mean, we certainly as people analysing elections, we draw this very regular comparison between the UK and the US. Because there's quite a distinctive difference, and I think key to things like trust are obviously the quality of the journalism, but I think the partisanship that we would find particularly on television, which is that it used to be definitely the king of the jungle in terms of where people are watching. Obviously now we have social media and we have people like Trump speaking to his audience directly without that being mediated by any journalists as a sort of, an intermediate stage. But I think such is the partisanship of US TV. We anybody switching on, you've pretty well got to pick a flavour and stick with that. I mean, and it's a very strong flavour that you're going to be getting, and as a consequence of picking your flavour, you're never going to hear any views that are kind of are different, that are challenging that. Now, that might suit lots of people. You'd just like to have your views kind of reconfirmed and regurgitated back to you in a different form. I think in the UK, we have this thing in the middle called public service broadcasting. Now, however you feel about the BBC and however you feel about how that delivers on those principles, that's in some ways a side issue. But the principles of public service broadcasting, regulated, is you've got to be impartial. You can't tell people how to vote, and you have to adhere to these principles of due impartiality, where you have to, you have to find that middle ground between what's going on. Now, whilst you've got those principles, there is always hope, isn't there? Whether the BBC is doing a good job there, again, we could make 10 series of podcasts just about that, couldn't we? But I think that trust is always likely to be higher in the UK, because you've got that central pillar that is at least attempting or is designed to give you opposing views on the same channel. But honestly, having watched some of the coverage here, it's very partisan. That said, I think a significant moment in the TV debate was that the moderators started to fact check Donald Trump as he was speaking, and in a way that has not happened before. And one of the saving graces, I think, of American broadcasting is during the Trump years, they have not shied away from cutting away from speeches. They have fact checked him. They have held him to account in a way that is surprising, but it's also very sort of heartening to see. So I think there are two things really that can save public trust. One is, public service and the principles thereof, and the other is the burgeoning enthusiasm and importance and significance of fact checking.
Just to say could I just say on fact checking, just because I taught a module about disinformation last year, and one of the sources we looked up was the Washington Post. It does a kind of has a pretty massive fact checking database. I think they have over 30,000 misleading statements attributed to Donald Trump during his presidential term, which is an impressive feat, actually, to be honest, on both his part and the Washington Post's part. But I would say, on the other hand, fact checking has proved pretty ineffectual by and large. I think the kind of real time integration into moderation during a debate was a really important innovation. But as we've just said, Donald Trump has basically withdrawn from those kind of formats, maybe precisely for those reasons. So that the kind of even where people have done fact checking and there's protocols for fact checking and citing the sources and everything like that, it hasn't proved particularly effectual at changing people's minds, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, and I think it definitely speaks into we're talking about the Trump camp kind of enjoying this kind of victim narrative now with the Labour Party becoming involved. That was kind of the immediate spin following that debate it was a 2v1, it was a 3v1. Trump was being, ganged up on by the reporters who were simply saying that Haitian immigrants aren't eating pets and dogs or whatever. But that kind of knee-jerk reaction to say we're not going to accept some kind of responsibility, instead we're going to pivot towards attacking the institution, is kind of what I think is not setting the foundation. I think it's already set the foundation for an era of permanent distrust. Especially as Richard kind of speaks to, it's one or the other. It's so black and white when it comes to media consumption in the US. But anyway, that's all very depressing and horrible. So I think a nice kind of way to wrap up would be to participate in the fool's game and say, do you think that anything can be done over the course of the next week? I know you've both spoken about Harris perhaps being bolder on policy, but do you see perhaps a shift in media strategy, a shift in policy approach, a shift in anything to try and claw back some of that advantage that Harris had. Because if we're talking anything above like 2 points, I think is kind of generally the accepted consensus for winning both the popular and the electoral college. Anything below that, you start to get into the machinations of which states have you won, and there becomes a question. So if she's only got a week left to save her campaign, what do you guys suggest that she does?
I'll leave the last word to Matt, but I think she's got a week to pull a rabbit out of her hat. I don't think Trump is bumbling along in his own special way that only he can, but he doesn't seem to be doing himself any damage. Harris has to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and quickly, because I think at best her campaign has been a little insipid, and she's just failed, even when offered those brilliant opportunities at the end of that debate, has just not landed a good enough punch on Trump.
Yeah, and I suppose so this is where the actual website is quite informative. So the overall like market, so we have about 70, 80, maybe 100 people in the market now, is still makes Harris a sort of 60-40 favorite. So kind of contrary, it's nearly the opposite of the betting market in that regard. And I still make Harris a stronger favorite, so like I'd have her about 80, 82%. Because of those fundamentals, primarily, right? So I think that structural advantage can still be kind of activated without anything. In a way, it's kind of a basic campaign, but like with a lot of energy and focus is what she needs to do. But also, I guess, just one other thing to kind of weigh in here is that, and this is where we come back to a running theme about polling bias and how polls actually work. So obviously, the 2016 and 2020 both over predicted the Democrats, and you'll remember, Richard, I was kind of thinking, well, I was convinced there'd be some kind of adjustment that would maybe underpredict the Democrats. Now, if you do look at like the 2022 midterms and elections in that kind of narrow window, the Democrats have been consistently underpredicted by the polls. So that's not very useful when the bias keeps moving around. But it is the case that Democrats have tended to be underpredicted in the most recent elections. So I guess, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that like Harris just has to put across that things are actually okay. But more generally, just be, how would I say it? Be fun. Be fun. Be like out there with drop a verse in with Eminem if that's what it takes. Yeah, like essentially, I think the pandering to the kind of potentially disaffected Republicans is not the best use of the resources that campaign has. Actually persuading Democrats that it's worth their while voting, not just to avoid Trump, but because things are actually getting better in the economy. Like that's their path to success, and that's literally what, what was the guy's name, Richard, who did It's the Economy Stupid back in the day? Cargill, was that his name? James Cargill. Like Bill Clinton's campaign advisor back in the day said it's the economy stupid, and it's the economy stupid is actually true of nearly every election campaign. So it's the economy stupid, and they do have that advantage, and that's what I think they need to activate.
I'm just wondering whether we're going to see a headline saying it was Slim Shady what won it.
Yeah. Well, if put it this way, if Harris doesn't do well, I'm going to like come last in my own forecasting tournament, which wouldn't be a good look. I might never live that down.
No, okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your insights. I'm hopeful that we'll be back kind of on the air maybe later this week or early next week to kind of provide a little update, see how things have changed, because it is incredibly competitive now. Well, I mean, not that it wasn't before, but we're within the margin of error of the margin of error at this point. Every single state has fluctuated from, the swing states have been fluctuating from kind of lean Republican, lean Democrat to toss-up territory. So I don't even think we need a big October surprise for anything to kind of pivot in any one direction. But Harris doing some kind of freestyle rap with Eminem, I think would tip the balance. So thank you, Matt, thank you, Richard, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by our partners at Focus Games and the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, or WIZARD, as well as Swansea University. If you want to participate in our forecasting tournament, head to horseracepolitics.co.uk. That's horseracepolitics.co.uk. No spaces, all one word, all lowercase. Thanks for listening.